Private members' business, notice number 1.
Mr. Braddock.
I move the motion standing in my name on the notice paper relating to gambling harm and gambling policy.
Question is the motion be agreed, Mr. Braddock.
This is a tale of power, control and consequences. To understand how we've got to where we are today, we need to take a step back and rewind almost 4 years to the start of the 10th Assembly. The two parties agreed to the following item in the Parliamentary and Governing Agreement in Appendix 1.E.3, and I quote, establish a rigorous across-venue self-exclusion regime across the ACT for people experiencing harm from gaming with significant penalties for breaches. This exclusion regime will align with or exceed reforms currently progressing in New South Wales to allow exclusion by family members, end quote. This is what the two parties agreed to, and every single Labor and Greens member in this place signed this agreement. It seems some of those signatures had more intent behind them than others. The Greens Gaming Minister, Mr. Rattenbury, on multiple occasions presented a proposal to achieve this objective. However, at every turn, he was met with avoidance, delay and rejection from the Labor Party. I do not want to spend too long on the topic of the CMS, because we'll deal with this in a lot more detail on Thursday, but it is worth reminding ourselves as to what it is. A centralised monitoring system is a basic regulatory tool that lets the government to keep tabs on poker machines. Originally implemented for tax purposes, they have been operated on the premise that the gambling industry is one that cannot be trusted to properly self-regulate, self-monitor and correctly report their tax obligations. Somehow, the local gambling industry has managed to convince successive Labor ministers since the year 2000 that the ACT is somehow different and can be trusted to do the right thing, never mind any evidence to the contrary. It's time to talk about how I think this came about. Here in the ACT, the Labor Party doesn't simply get lobbied by the gambling industry, they themselves are part of it. They've done some work to mask those connections over the years, but the fact remains that, including under electoral law, the Canberra Labor Club and the ACT Labor Party are associated entities, intrinsically linked. The Labor Club was originally set up for the express purpose of supporting the Labor Party, including financially. For decades, a slice of the club's gambling profits would be used to fund the Labor Party, and in a manner to which they became accustomed and reliant. Over time, it became increasingly apparent how much gambling harm was occurring at these venues and how much people were pointing to the flow of money between the club and the party as evidence of Labor's conflict of interest. There was a push forming to ban donations from gambling licence holders. Labor therefore fiddled their arrangements. The 1973 Foundation was established on the 21st of October 2010. The following financial year, the public record with Elections ACT does not say precisely when, $3.6 million of capital was transferred from the Labor Club to the Foundation. That was followed in 2013-14 with an additional $2.5 million injection, meaning that the Labor Party had used the profits of gambling harm to establish a $6.1 million investment vehicle. It would give the appearance of their finances no longer being derived from gambling harm and instead other, more legitimate sources. You could say that the money had been washed. Labor are trust fund children benefiting from the profits of the gambling harm. Regardless of what you might like to call it, it leaves the Labor Party forever indebted to their gambling assets. To this day, the Labor Party continues to appoint a majority of directors to the Labor Club's board, people whom they don't need to tell what to do. That's how corporate appointments work in our capitalist market economy after all. The club continues to operate for the implied benefit of the Labor Party, and the club can move resolutions in support of the club at Labor Party conferences, including one straight from the gaming industry's playbook. It's also worth remembering that while the tap has been turned off on the flow of the money between the club and the party for the time being, there is nothing stopping transfers like it turning on again. There is nothing stopping the transfer of assets from other undertakings, like the new property development or hotel enterprises, from flowing across, all made possible by the liquidity provided by the poker machines. The income also includes government grants designed to help make the clubs less dependent on poker machine revenue. Not that they're actually giving up on the machines. or living with less revenue from their existing machines. This is where things get scary. We're increasingly realising that the association between the number of poker machines and the harm they inflict is rather loose. It doesn't really matter how many poker machines a club has, as long as it's not zero, so much as how they are used. There is a massive amount of research that has been done on floor plans, game design, lights, sounds and hospitality, all for the express purpose of increasing the amount of time people spend sitting in front of the poker machines. With the advent of big data, facial recognition software and behavioural analytics powered by artificial intelligence, the potential for harm to be wrought from gaming machines has been massively supercharged. A club could quite feasibly halve the number of machines it has, pocket the payouts from handing the licences back to the government, and make just as much, if not more money, from the optimised machines that they retain. The challenge to that model, powered by big data, are systems which monitor the machines in the same way. The same technology that allows gambling operators to seduce and entice also allows government to intervene and put up guardrails. But to do that, you need a regulatory backbone, a centralised monitoring system. For the first time, big data is allowing for a technology that would generally threaten the profitability of the pokies by genuinely preventing gambling harm. The gambling industry fears it, the clubs fear it, Labor fears it. If we are to effectively deal with Labor in the future, then they need to properly kick the habit and get through rehab. And to kick that habit, they need to sever the ties to poker machines, either by having the Labor Club divest from them or by cutting the ties to the Labor Club. Either will do. My only interest is severing the governance connection between the two. For the rehabilitation, they need to empower the advocates of harm reduction by giving them the proceeds from gambling that they profit from today. That's $6.1 million in capital by my calculations. And that's what I'm calling for today.
Question is the motion be agreed. Mr Barr.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Labor won't be supporting Mr Braddock's motion this afternoon. The motion and indeed some of the language contained within Mr Braddock's speech are provocative, defamatory and unreasonable and are not the sort of contribution that lends itself to any potential really to forge a consensus on gaming reform. Now we are in the final sitting week of this Assembly and I've been around politics long enough to know, Madam Speaker, that as we get closer to election day, that the rhetoric increases, the level of political discourse often degenerates, and I think we have a prime example of that in this motion. We're only debating this motion, Madam Speaker, because the amendments to the Gaming Machine Act that Mr Braddock was proposing to move in 2 days were unconstitutional. And this is a disappointing contribution to what should be a more serious debate about a shared pathway to reform. Now, in the spirit of trying to find a pathway to reform, we have been able to reach agreement on a number of issues with the Greens political party. So I can advise the Assembly following...
I'm having trouble hearing, so if you two want to have a discussion, can you please take it outside? Mr Barr.
I can advise the Assembly that there has been an agreement reached with the Greens party on a number of reforms to reduce the harm caused.
Gentlemen,
You've got to go outside, please. No, we are in the final week, but the level of poor behaviour in this place, Madam Speaker, is setting a record for the time I've been in here. Labor has reached an agreement with the Greens political party on a number of reforms to reduce the harm caused by electronic gaming machines in the Territory. Now, as outlined in the Parliamentary and Governing Agreement and delivered by the Minister for Gaming, we have a piece of legislation before this place that we will debate before we conclude these sittings to reduce the number of machines further to 3,500. Recognising that before this process of machine number reduction began, we had nearly 5,000 machines in the Territory, Madam Speaker, and on a per capita basis had one of the highest proportions of gaming machines to residents of any jurisdiction anywhere in the world. That is now no longer the case. And further reductions in the number of gaming machines in the Territory, we believe, combined with other measures, are an appropriate way forward. And some of the other measures that we've been able to reach agreement with the Greens political party include a regulated reduction in operating hours for EGMs to allow them to operate between 10 a.m. and 2 a.m. That means EGMs would not be able to operate between 2 a.m. and 10 a.m. each day. This will provide a mandated break in play and will reduce harm, something that both parties can agree on. Further, both parties have agreed to the establishment of an independent inquiry to assist in advising government on the steps necessary to develop and implement a club industry revenue, activity and worker transition plan. Now, I am hopeful that these initial steps can then lead to further work on practical measures to reduce harms caused by gambling addiction while supporting a sustainable community club sector. I believe these initial reforms, Madam Speaker, are a welcome step forward and open the door to further reforms in the next term of the Assembly. And beyond these areas of agreement, we would support, as a Labor Party, the introduction of further harm reduction measures, such as continued progressive reduction in the number of gaming machines in the Territory to 1,000 machines by 2045. The introduction of account-based cashless gaming, covering both Keno and EGMs, with player activity statements in real time, the ability to delay access to winnings, mandatory delay top-up mechanisms, and pop-up public health messaging and support service information. Mandatory pre-commitment, Madam Speaker, including a daily, monthly and yearly loss limit established at the time of setting up an account. If the default amount is reached, the account will not permit further gambling. Mandatory breaks in play, including a mandated 15-minute break in play after an hour of continuous play. And self-exclusion from gambling, where users will be excluded from participating in EGM gambling, and a framework for third-party exclusions to also be explored. Now, we believe these measures will reduce harm and that they can be put in place without a central monitoring system. Now, whilst we recognise the potential merits of a CMS, there are several practical concerns that have been raised that further work will be needed to address. And these include how a CMS would operate within a framework of ongoing machine number reductions in the Territory, how the cost of implementation and ongoing operation of a CMS could be reduced, the cost-sharing arrangements between the club industry and taxpayers in the implementation and ongoing operation of a CMS, and the interaction with nearby New South Wales venues, given the ability to circumvent an ACT CMS through access to unlinked machines just across the border in New South Wales. These are issues that we would like to see adequately addressed before we could support the implementation of a CMS. Discussion on these matters is ongoing, Madam Speaker, and workable solutions may be found in a future legislative assembly. But this will only occur in an environment where these issues are put on the table and they are discussed in a way that is sensible and practical. And those discussions have been ongoing and they have resulted in some progress, Madam Speaker. Progress that was outlined in the Parliamentary and Governing Agreement, some of which will be achieved in this term of government. Other areas, like the CMS, were not explicitly part of the Parliamentary and Governing Agreement. So from here, it is important that the areas of agreement are quickly progressed. And I think, judging by the amendment that Mr Parton has moved in relation to the inquiry, there would appear to be unanimous agreement that that pathway should be pursued, and I welcome that. I also welcome a commitment to further reduce the number of machines to 3,500 by passing the bill that the Minister for Gaming has introduced and that we will debate this week. We strongly support that. We also welcome the agreement with the Greens political party to take a more immediate step to reduce harm by further restricting the hours of operation of EGMs. That can be done by regulation and could come into effect following a period of a regulatory impact statement early in 2025, many years ahead of some of the other elements of harm reduction that we are talking about, and should be able to progress in the next term of the Assembly. So the fundamental premise of Mr Braddock's provocative motion that reform is not possible is proven false by the outcomes already achieved and the pathway that lies ahead. Politics is the art of compromise, Madam Speaker, and I know that is difficult weeks ahead of an election. But I am pleased and I do acknowledge the work that Mr Rattenbury and I and our colleagues have been able to achieve to be able to make this commitment this afternoon. I acknowledge there are still points of difference, and there are. But they can be worked through. But they're not going to be worked through in an environment like the one Mr Braddock has created this afternoon. Now, people can choose many different approaches in politics. Generally speaking, provocative, defamatory approaches don't yield outcomes. I'll make that observation after several decades of active political life. So my commitment and the commitment of my Labor colleagues is to work towards the program that we have outlined. There is much common ground, possibly even with Mr Parton and the Liberals on some elements of this. I think the community expects that where we can find agreement, we move forward. But the community also accepts that there are legitimate reasons for disagreement, and the costs associated with particular courses of action need to be considered. And fundamental for the Labor Party is the suite of harm reduction measures that I have spoken about and a continued reduction in the number of gaming machines in the Territory. That's what we will work towards, and we welcome the support of any other members in this place who want to see that agenda implemented. For these reasons, we will not support Mr Braddock's motion today, but we do stand ready to continue to work with Assembly members to implement further harm reduction measures.
Question is that the motion be agreed. Mr Parton.
Madam Speaker, isn't this a fascinating piece of theatre that's playing out before us? Every election year here in the ACT, we see a faux divorce play out between Labor and the Greens as they seek to pretend to the electorate that as political parties, they have an entirely different agenda to each other. Well, this time it's kind of real. It's kind of real. The relationship between the two governing parties has broken down to its lowest point in the century so far. And given that Labor and the Greens are the ones actually flying the plane, it's a bit scary for all the passengers. In the last 3 weeks, we've seen amendments from Mr Braddock to the now heavily contentious gaming machine surrender bill. That bill has now become a battleground between Labor and the Greens in the gaming space as Mr Rattenbury and Dr Patterson flex their policy muscles and put on a show. They put on show their ideological dogma while both seeking, well, you could be forgiven for believing that they're both seeking to destroy the entire club sector to appease their progressive bases. One of Mr Braddock's amendments sought to force the ACT Labor Party to sever all of its ties with the Labor clubs here in Canberra. Now, the amendment has apparently been ruled by the Government Solicitor's Office to be full of legal holes to the point of being unenforceable. And so we now find that previous legislative amendment before us in the form of a motion, even though the Greens know full well that if it were passed, it can't be implemented. I guess the other thing that fascinates me with this is it's always about the Labor clubs. Given that this is the only place where there's still any formal relationship between the Labor Party and the CFMEU, I just wonder why the tradies is not included. But I guess given the rhetoric at that heavily attended event in Woden, they're probably more with you blokes at the moment than with them. In this motion, we see the worst in the relationship between the two governing partners on show, and it's not terribly becoming. It's difficult to have this debate today without a view to a debate coming later in the week on the gaming machine surrender bill. The Canberra Liberals are deeply concerned that we as a parliament are on the verge of passing laws that were simply drawn up as a part of the political gamesmanship playing out between Labor and the Greens. And I don't know that that's how we should do it. We're concerned that many jobs will be lost and an entire sector sacrificed to satisfy the desire of Labor and the Greens to have a loud squabble in this space. And so the Canberra Liberals are standing back and attempting to arrive at a sensible conclusion, and that hopefully the three of us, and I mean, Mr Rattenbury giggles, but I don't know that anyone can question that my negotiation in this space has genuinely been aimed at arriving at a sensible conclusion. I'm proposing that we agree, and I know Mr Barr's already made mention of it, to an independent inquiry into the clubs and gaming space, and I have proposed an extensive terms of reference. As such, I would like to move the amendment circulated in my name.
Question is Mr Parton's amendment be agreed, Mr Parton?
Canberra Liberals are the only party in this Assembly that is genuinely mindful of the huge commitment that our clubs make to this city. As a Tuggeranong resident, I cannot imagine the South Side without the Vikings clubs, the Southern Cross Club, the Cornwall Club and the Burns Club. Haven't missed anyone, have I? There is never a month goes by when I don't frequent at least one of those venues for so many reasons. They form the centrepiece of entertainment and hospitality in the Valley, and Tuggeranong would be a much less vibrant place without their existence. Dr Patterson asserts that if the clubs didn't have poker machines, that they could somehow provide all of the same services that they do now, and it's fairy tale stuff. They simply could not. And indeed, the Molonglo Valley will never get to experience the positive impacts of clubs because of the change to law that Dr Patterson passed in this place earlier in the term. Our clubs are so much a part of the fabric of Canberra, and if Labor and the Greens have their way, we will be throwing the baby out with the bathwater, we'll be cooking the goose that laid the golden eggs, and the only reason we'll be doing it is to appease a voter base. We are happy for our Labor and Greens colleagues to slug it out in this motion, and as such, I've in my amendments, I've left all of Mr Braddock's motion as it stands. I've left them there. It's time right now to inject some common sense into the debate and call for an independent inquiry into the space. We need to have a real conversation about taxes and charges, about things that are inhibiting the sector's ability to diversify. We need to have a real conversation about skills requirements and training. We need to have a conversation about practical options, timelines, and assistance measures for helping the sector significantly reduce its reliance on EGM revenue. We need the adoption of evidence-based evaluated harm minimisation initiatives that are scale appropriate in terms of technology options and financial implications. And it's something which I think is often disregarded in discussions in this place about this area. We are a small city and we've got to consider scale. We need to examine the community contribution scheme and how its impact can be maximised. We need to determine the real financial contribution that the ACT licensed club sector contributes to the ACT economy, because it's massive. It's massive. Particularly when it comes to community, sporting sectors, especially with respect to facilities management. Mr. Barr made mention of, the fact that we are an island within New South Wales, and that to some extent, whatever we do can be usurped by organisations just over the border. We need to examine the cross-border economic relationship between the ACT and New South Wales in terms of the revenue generated by the club sector, any negative impacts to the ACT economy, to the benefit of the ACT adjacent communities in New South Wales. We need to examine the potential value of harmonisation between New South Wales and ACT regulation on harm minimisation objectives. And I would point out, because we are going to have a discussion about central monitoring systems. Of course, they've got one going on in New South Wales. Mr. Barr's already made mention of the fact that whatever we set up here wouldn't necessarily dovetail with New South Wales. So why aren't we heading in the direction of a harmonisation involving the two jurisdictions so that we could piggyback on that? I know that there have been very early conversations about the potential for that happening, at least in clubland, and I just wonder why that's not being considered. We need to be examining the extent to which the ACT government needs to focus on online and other forms of gambling. We need to review the extent to which ACT government EGM gambling harm initiatives encourage a move to other gambling types, because at the end of the day, we just want to make life better for individuals. We don't want to push them to something else. We need to investigate, we need to investigate any possible conflict of interest arising from the connection between the ACT Labor Party and the Labor clubs in Canberra. And I appreciate the points that Mr. Braddock makes in this space, but let's at an inquiry level have a look at it. We all understand the history of the 1973 foundation. I've got to say, I sometimes wonder why there wasn't a decision made to just separate completely and then the argument would be done. But that's up to the Labor Party to sort out. So I understand, and it's sort of been suggested by Mr. Barr. I understand that Clubs ACT wrote to the Chief Minister regarding a potential inquiry of this nature, and my understanding is that the response was quite positive. And so I genuinely put this amendment on the table in the hope that we can arrive at a sensible conclusion. Thank you.
The question is that Mr. Parton's amendment be agreed. Dr. Patterson.
I rise to speak to Mr. Braddock's motion. I'll start by saying exactly what this is. It's a juvenile political stunt. It demonstrates perfectly what the ACT Greens' priorities are, taking political hits rather than actually reducing gambling harm. To your own admission, Mr. Braddock, your amendments that you and your party went public with could easily be challenged in a court and would cost the taxpayer significantly. So you pivot to this stunt of a motion. There's not much to say on this motion. ACT Labor has not accepted donations from the ACT Labor Club for over 10 years now. It's a lucky thing that track records of what people and parties have delivered here are all on the public record. And it's a funny coincidence that gambling harm reform firmly comes to a halt over the last 4 years under a Greens minister. In the 9th Assembly, Labor Minister Ramsey reduced the number of authorisations in the Territory by more than 1,000, and significant reform to the Community Club Contribution Scheme. The Chief Minister introduced the betting operations tax and has since increased the tax to 25%. This led to Sportsbet removing their Bets with Mates feature, a very harmful feature from their Canberra consumers. I introduced a bill last year and passed in February to see the Molonglo Valley and other undeveloped areas of Canberra never see pokies in their communities. The only bill Minister Rattenbury has passed this term was the Club Refuge Bill. Under Minister Rattenbury, EGM authorisations have reduced around 100. However, there are more machines now in operation in the Territory than they were in November 2020. Minister Rattenbury or the ACT Greens have not introduced or passed a single piece of legislation or motion in this term to reduce gambling harm. The ACT Greens have a central monitoring system on the table. Minister Rattenbury was quoted through the Canberra Times yesterday, and I quote, "Minister Rattenbury has previously said that the system would cost less than 5% of poker machine profits over the next 20 years. That number is approximately 180 million. Minister Rattenbury also was at pains to stress through texting into the ABC yesterday, and I quote, less than 1 year's revenue from machines. That's also around 180 million. According to Minister Rattenbury, a CMS costs around 180 million. I don't think you need to tell anybody in here that that is an extortionate cost. And to the point of my line of questioning to the Minister for the last 2.5 years, it fundamentally confirms that investment in a CMS is an investment in poker machines. Purchasing a CMS will lock machines into the Territory for decades to come. And for what outcomes? To stop a few people that would, instead of going from Hellenic Club to Mawson Raiders Club, would have to go from Hellenic Club to Queanbeyan. That's $180 million to add an extra few kilometres onto someone's drive. Labor's vision is of a Territory with minimal access to machines. The research shows that the closer you live in proximity to poker machines, the more likely you are to participate in poker machine play and to experience harm. Research evidence suggests that people living in the towers at Woden are nearly 6% more likely to experience gambling harm than someone living in Molonglo Valley. ACT Labor recognises that this is a long-term plan to address harm. We also need short-term measures, such as cashless gaming with a raft of harm reduction measures. These measures will also face the Queanbeyan issue, but they won't cost $180 million. Clubs have already been proactive in their engagement with the cashless gaming space. I know of at least one club that has said to Minister Rattenbury over this term that they would be happy to have a cashless trial site, but no interest from the Minister. The ACT Greens only woke up this year to the fact that they committed to addressing gambling harm last election. And unfortunately, I don't believe it was my questioning and challenging them on policy debates that woke them up. It was the forthcoming election. What we've heard over the past few months from Minister Rattenbury and colleagues is that it's Labor holding up reform. But every story has two sides. And from my perspective, questioning a Greens policy position of $180 million expenditure has exposed a rigid, inflexible party that prioritises ideology and grandstanding over practical solutions and evidence. The current motion is a case in evidence. I would also like to point out to Mr. Braddock's and rebut Mr. Braddock's words in his own speech that he said the gambling industry can't be trusted to monitor themselves. Well, I'm not sure what he thinks a central monitoring system is or who would be the central monitor, but in all other states and all other jurisdictions, the central monitoring system is run by the gambling industry, Tabcorp in many states. So this would be handing over $180 million to the gambling industry to monitor the gambling industry. The harm experienced by people in the Territory from pokies is an incredibly serious issue and one that I've been committed to for nearly 2 decades. Unfortunately, it is an issue that is absolutely lost in these political games that the Greens would prefer to play. 31% of Canberrans experience gambling harm, and right now, 1 in 3 people who are sitting at EGMs in Canberra, and believe me, there are many people sitting at a poker machine right now, are experiencing harm. And instead of debating legislation to reduce that harm and save people's lives and livelihoods, we're here discussing this motion. Thank you.
Question is that Mr Parton's amendment be agreed. Ms Vazzarati.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to speak in support of Mr Braddock's motion regarding reducing gambling harm. It seeks to break the nexus that is potentially impacting on our government's ability to implement meaningful and evidence-based reform. I come to this debate having worked for many years to achieve gambling reform in an attempt to protect the community from products that are designed to be addictive and have done incredible damage to many individuals and families in the ACT. In my work in the community sector and on ACAT, I've seen the real-life impacts of gambling harms on people's lives, which prompted my work and passion in this area. I've sat on the Gambling and Racing Commission Board as a designated position with gambling harm expertise and pushed for the Commission to take a public health approach to gambling harm. When I became so concerned that the regulator could not effectively deal with gambling harm due to the policy and government settings, I resigned from the Commission. In doing this, I noted that the government was doing a good job, but the settings were highly problematic. I was keen to advocate for changes in government policy. Following this, I co-founded the Canberra Gambling Reform Alliance with a group of like-minded advocates committed to ensuring that we got better policy around gambling harm. Research commissioned by the Alliance found that contrary to the vision of ourselves as a progressive community, in the area of gambling regulations, we were laggards, influenced significantly by our location in the middle of New South Wales, the pokey capital of the world. It was surprising to learn just how far behind we were with little and poor regulation. The Alliance also commissioned research to identify some of the key tools and mechanisms that could reduce gambling harm. We also found the community was with us. Community sentiment research commissioned found that overwhelmingly there was support from the community to bring in much stronger laws to regulate poker machines. Despite this, there is no doubt that reform in this area is incredibly difficult. We are up against powerful vested interests with deep pockets, money essentially that has come from the depths of human despair. The seminal Productivity Commission report of 2010 laid out some of the key things that were needed, and they essentially said a core component was to tackle the design feature of a product designed to be addictive. We also saw at a national level the furious attacks led by industry hell-bent on protecting profits and stopping regulation. However, over the last 2 decades, we have seen some reforms. We were previously in a place where ACT Labor suggested that poker machine licences should be increased according to population. Yeah, a bit like doctors, to a begrudging understanding that there was a need not only to limit growth but to reduce numbers. But let's just remember how we got this reform around the reduction of numbers. Let's reflect on the minimal shift we've seen, and it has been because of the ACT Greens pushing for reform. The reduction of poker machine numbers occurred due to the agreement in the parliamentary agreement of the 9th Assembly, which included the Greens' proposal to reduce numbers. This happened after Labor decided to conduct negotiations on poker reform. That is specifically what they would not do via the media in the lead up to finalising the agreement. But we were able to get this reform into the negotiated agreement. Again, in the lead up to the 2020 election, the ACT Greens took a strong platform to the election, including additional reform to progress in this term of government. Further reduction in the numbers, but also to deal with the design features of machines. Particularly in a jurisdiction where we essentially have mini casinos in our suburbs, there's no doubt that less machines can help, particularly when we can achieve pokey-free venues. However, what we often see is that when numbers in a venue are reduced, its practical effect is that the remaining machines become more profitable. And when we're looking at a time frame of 20 years, we need to recognise the harm being done by machines while they remain on the floors of clubs all over Canberra. I'm the mum of two young men who've recently turned 18. I've seen firsthand the predatory behaviour of the gambling industry towards them and their friends. This industry has successfully socialised and normalised gambling both online and in real life. These young people, and all young people across Canberra, don't have 20 years to wait to deliver half-hearted reform through a reduction in numbers. Thankfully, in my household's case, they have a parent who has countered the inducements with evidence and warnings, but many households don't need this. For many years, the evidence has been that some of the most impactful ways we can reduce harm is to deal with the design features that make pokies addictive. In more recent times, recognising opportunities to make mechanisms such as self-exclusion actually work has also emerged. The last two elections have seen the ACT Greens bring strong evidence-based reform to the table. Some of these reforms have hit significant technical barriers. It could be suggested that designers of machines have made it far more difficult than it's needed to be. And that's why the identification of the use of tools such as a central monitoring system to deliver harm minimisation mechanisms was a really exciting possibility. It's useful to reflect that it is pretty unbelievable that a multi-million dollar industry is operating on a manual, paper-based system. We are the only place in Australia where this is the case. This is an industry that has significant integrity risks, and it's pretty extraordinary that the industry has been able to duck the costs associated with appropriate management of these products. However, now we face a situation where there's further incentive to introduce this system that will also facilitate significant opportunities to reduce harm, not in 20 years, but in 2 years. And yet, we've been stalled in moving this option forward. I wonder why. I commend this motion to the Assembly.
The question is that Mr Parton's amendment be agreed. Ms Davidson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This motion from Mr Braddock today is not just rhetoric. It's an important policy issue that we need to debate. Minister Rattenbury has previously noted in this place that the 2019 ACT Gambling Survey found that approximately 34,000 ACT adults are at-risk gamblers. The Productivity Commission's inquiry report Gambling in 2010 highlighted that an increase in the rate of gambling harm is associated with the increasing density of gaming machines. There's a clear relationship between domestic violence and the density of pokies in our community. Research published in 2017 shows that police record 20% fewer domestic and family violence incidents and 30% fewer domestic violence assaults in postcodes with no pokies compared to postcodes with at least 75 machines per 10,000 people in Victoria. Gambling addiction fuels domestic and family violence, resulting in more frequent and more severe incidents of violence. According to a study published in the Journal of the Society for the Study of Addiction on the 21st of August of this year, Australians lose more money on gambling per capita than any other country in the world, and 90% of that is spent on pokies. Gambling has real impacts across our community. According to the study, each 10% increase in annual gambling expenditure in New South Wales is associated with a 7.4% increase in assaults, 10.5% increase in break and enter dwelling offences, 10.3% increase in break and enter non-dwelling offences, 11% increase in motor vehicle theft offences, 8.2% increase in stealing from motor vehicle theft offences and 7.4% increase in fraud offences. And it's not just New South Wales that has this issue. I was having a conversation some years ago with a Victorian police detective that when he went out on shift in the Melbourne CBD, he said his quickest way of finding someone who was actually in the act of committing an offence, like breaking into a car, was to just go for a walk near the casino. And I think that actually sounds like something I would expect to hear. It's a pretty long-known problem. Many years ago, I used to actually park my car next to the local police station in between the two biggest pokies venues in Woden while I was working in the town centre all day, and my car was broken into so frequently that I used to leave the glove box open and empty and didn't even bother fixing the door locks anymore. Now, a study published in The Lancet in December 2023 found that 4.2% of suicides in Victoria were because of gambling. Studies in Sweden published in November of 2023 have shown that gambling dependence is associated with higher risks of cardiovascular disease, respiratory-related disease and diabetes. In addition, based on induction screening questions to new arrivals at the Alexander McConaughey Centre by Corrections, I expect that there are at least 8 or 9 people in the AMC right now who would tell us that gambling is a contributing factor to the offences that they were charged with if their voices were able to be heard in this place. Now, in my work in Canberra, I've seen the impact of gambling harms on families who've been unable to put food on the table or maintain their housing, community organisations who've experienced losses from fraud, and on people who've ended up in the justice system because of their addiction to gambling. Reducing the number of machines in our communities will make a real difference to the outcomes for people's lives and for the ACT budget, but we can make also a real difference in harm reduction by implementing cashless gaming and a central monitoring system while also reducing machine numbers. We can do both. I want to thank Minister Rattenberry for his tireless work to reduce the harms of gambling through every method available to us, and for always doing this through consultation with gambling harm reduction advocates, with clubs and with the Canberra community. His patience, his thorough policy work and attention to the detail on how to make these changes most effective, and his persistence in trying to overcome every barrier put in front of him, noting that our Attorney-General cannot bring a bill to this place for debate without Cabinet agreement, is a demonstration of his commitment to good outcomes, as well as the right process to get there. And it is a privilege to work with an Attorney-General with his skill and integrity. It would be good if the Labor political party were able to find a way to work with us to support the harm reduction work that we've been trying to achieve during this term in government by implementing a central monitoring system in addition to other harm reduction measures and machine number reductions. This is an issue where I think good policy is more important than politics, and I would welcome members of any political party in having all of us work together to reduce gambling harms in the community through evidence-based best practice measures, including a CMS.
Question is that Mr Parton's amendment be agreed. Mr Rattenbury.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of Mr Braddock's motion today. Why we've ended up in this position, where we are having to formally call on the ACT Labor Party to sever its connections with poker machines. It's not a position we wanted to end up in, but the events have shown that this is necessary. The Labor Party and the Labor members of government have shown that they are unable to approach gambling policy in a reasonable and evidence-based way. Their approach to gambling has for many years been characterised by inertia and resistance. It has been the Greens who have managed to lock in harm reduction measures, primarily by reducing the numbers of poker machine licences in the ACT. Contrary to the version of history that's been presented by Dr Patterson this afternoon, we have reduced numbers from over 5,000 in 2015 to about 3,700 a day. And that's because of Greens putting it into the parliamentary agreements. We needed to lock in those changes through those parliamentary agreements, and I'll talk more about machine reductions shortly. Because it has become clear that it is not a sufficient strategy for reducing harm. It is really this term of government that Labor's compromised approach to gambling policy has been exposed. It's reached an untenable point. I had hoped that this term of government we could make strong progress on gambling reform. I have been the ACT's gaming minister, and with access to the latest research and developments, with the expertise of the JACS Directorate, with information and advice provided by community sector representatives and experts, I developed a proposal for the government to consider. That proposal is best practice, costed and expert endorsed, and it is one that would most effectively reduce gambling harm from pokies. I've talked about this before, but to reiterate, the proposal would introduce mandatory account-based gambling for pokies, mandatory loss limits and time limits applying to anyone who wants to use ACT poker machines, and a central monitoring system that links pokies to make the harm reduction measures effective and territory-wide. The proposals I have presented are universally lauded by credible harm reduction advocates as an effective way to protect people from gambling harm from poker machines. It is what the Canberra Gambling Reform Alliance is calling for. It is what the National Alliance for Gambling Reform is calling for. It is what the ANU Centre for Gambling Research endorses as the way to reduce harm. And it is what the Justice and Community Safety Directorate researched and developed as an effective proposal. It is important to emphasise that the Labor Party's reaction to this proposal has been somewhat odd. I don't know whether to use the words recalcitrant, obstructionist, dismissive or undermining, but there has been a lot of wasted time and effort. Members may have seen my public comments where I said that my Greens colleagues and I always endeavour to work closely with the Labor Party colleagues to achieve progressive outcomes for the community. But gambling reform has evoked a strange reaction, and now we are forced to call it out because Labor does seem to have a difficult position on this issue. The Labor Party's response has really lacked evidence and has been especially political in my view. I cannot get support for the measures that I put forward as Gaming Minister. Now, the Chief Minister commented publicly saying the Greens were coming up with last-minute ad hoc proposals close to the election. Nothing could be further from the truth. The proposals were developed over the course of this term and taken to government for endorsement repeatedly. We're not talking about this because of the election. We're talking about this because this term of government is about to end and the Labor Party still has not supported the reforms despite my best efforts and working well within the process. Time is almost up, and when this type of obstruction occurs, it does need to be called out. So the Labor Party blocked and dismissed the best practice harm reduction proposal and instead decided to endorse an alternative proposal. In fact, a new Labor Party election commitment, it is the first one I can recall. That surprise proposal usurped the government and cabinet process. That policy was put out in a hasty, non-consultative fashion. You could tell by the club's reaction who said they were completely blindsided. It's as if Labor desperately needed to avoid the good harm reduction initiatives that were making their way through the government processes. As the Minister working on this issue, that's what it looks like. Like Labor said, well, quick, let's dodge this policy by whipping out our own substitute. The key part of the Labor gambling policy is to reduce the number of electronic gaming machines to 1,000 over the next 20 years. That is 2 decades or 5 terms of the Assembly. One of the important things to understand about reducing the number of pokies is that on its own, it is not going to protect people from harm. Reducing the number of pokies, even by large amounts, does not necessarily lead to a reduction in expenditure or harm. Now, I recently took the opportunity to meet with Dr. Charles Livingstone, one of Australia's foremost gambling researchers, and asked him for the latest research on this question. Does reducing machine numbers reduce harm? He was very clear that the research showed that simply reducing numbers, even by a large amount, doesn't necessarily lead to a reduction in harm. He talked about numerous examples that have been studied from around the world, including Australia, where machine numbers were reduced, but expenditure stayed the same or increased. The machine reductions didn't correlate with reduced harm, and that's been the same pattern in the Territory. Dr. Livingstone also pointed out that machines tend to migrate to areas of disadvantage. It's like they magically know how to cause the most harm. If you still have 3,000, 2,000, 1,000 machines, there is going to be a lot of harm occurring unless you put the proper protections on them, like the ones that I've been working on and developing and calling for. I'll add for the record that Dr. Livingstone also told me that the best way forward was to introduce the initiatives that I proposed to government. So under Labor's proposal, machine numbers will be reduced over 20 years. That means there will be thousands of pokies around the city in the coming decades, and they will continue causing harm to Canberrans, probably not even at a reduced rate. No, those thousands of machines need guardrails on them to protect people from harm. Now, the Labor proposal also does not ensure universality of harm reduction, which is essential to give these measures efficacy. To achieve this universality, we do need a central monitoring system or a CMS. It's the essential backbone to harm reduction measures like loss limits, and so far we do not have agreement to develop such a proposal. The National Alliance for Gambling Reform critiqued ACT Labor's proposal, saying that it lacked a centralised monitoring system to link together venues and allow binding and default loss limits. The founder of the Hope Project and co-chair of Canberra Gambling Reform Alliance was more direct in her criticism. She pointed out it would leave a high level of gambling harm in the Territory for decades. She said this approach must leave Canberra's gambling industry, and I quote, rubbing its hands together with glee. Now, one reason Labor said they don't support this necessary and effective CMS is the cost. My response, as has been noted today, is that the pokies earn clubs around $180 to $190 million a year, every single year, in net gaming machine revenue. Now, members of Cabinet have seen the preliminary costings and know that for a fraction of those profits, we could have a CMS to protect people from harm. What Dr. Passon didn't mention in her observations around costing is the point I was making, it was a 20-year cost to operate the system. Why are we not willing to invest in measures to stop the pernicious community harm from poker machines? That is a values question for every member of this place, and I know where the Greens members stand. I'll also point out to anyone concerned about costs that the alternative policy will undoubtedly has a cost as well. And despite a range of public commentary about costs, we've not seen that revelation. Where are the detailed costings for that policy? Let's scrutinise them in full, please. I've been challenged to say, well, where are your costings? They have gone to the Cabinet process. Everyone in this place understands that puts limits on me, and I've been steadfast in my endeavouring to stick to those rules. So let's understand it in full and actually make sure we're having an honest conversation about it. To answer the question is that there are no published costs for the alternative proposal, despite it being used to displace the effective and costed proposal that I have presented. Now, I'm going to run out of time for my remarks, but I think Mr. Braddock's motion seeks to draw on an important theory. He highlights the continuing compromising connection to poker machines through the Labor Club's operation of hundreds of poker machines, 436 licences, around 12% of the ACT's poker machines. In relation to this issue, I'll quote Dr. Charles Livingstone again, who I mentioned earlier. He said publicly about Labor's connection to pokies money, it raises a significant conflict of interest for the Labor Party to actually be regulating gambling machines when the party has a really powerful vested interest. They're impossibly compromised. That is the basis of this motion today. So for all of the commentary on the motivations for this motion, that is the core of it. Now, I am pleased to see that there is now discussion that we may be able to make progress in the future, and we are committed to that as well. So out the other side of this, we will need to knuckle down and keep trying to work, but we have got a long way to go. I'm frustrated that we've not been able to make progress in this term because we could have. And there's one clear reason why we haven't.
Question is that Mr. Parton's amendment be agreed. Mr. Braddock to Mr. Parton's amendment.
To Mr. Parton's amendments, and I seek to move my amendments to Mr. Parton's amendments.
Question is Mr. Braddock's amendments to Mr. Parton's amendment is agreed. Mr. Braddock.
I'd like to thank Mr. Parton for his amendments. Okay, sure, they're not the words I might necessarily use, but in the spirit of getting the Canberra Liberal support for the core concepts, I can agree with him with some small amendments for accuracy, which form the basis of the amendments I've circulated in my name. And Mr. Parton's 1H, I just want to emphasise, the Greens don't actually mind how the CMS is funded. The budgetary constraints on the government helping to pay for, or even fully paying for it, that matter, are interestingly ones for the Treasurer. That's open for him to resolve. As for Mr. Parton's 1J, I'd just like it to be clarified that Clubs ACT, who are the ones who are doomsaying the sector, Clubs ACT don't necessarily speak for all clubs, and most certainly not for those who have been without pokies for some time, such as the Polish club or the Irish club. So therefore, I'm just seeking to clarify exactly who is making that statement. And at Mr. Parton's 2A, I just want to be clear that the achievements here are not necessarily zero. There's a lot we would have liked to have done, and I can accept we failed to achieve. But as long as the legislation passes on Thursday, we can still see the conclusion of the voluntary and compulsory surrender scheme to bring the number of machines in the territory down to 3,500.
Thank you. So the question is Mr Braddock's amendment to Mr Parton's amendment is agreed. Mr Parton.
Madam Speaker, I'll be very brief just to say that we'll be supporting the Braddock amendment. Yeah, I mean, some of it's not quite accurate in terms of, like, I've spoken to a lot of clubs about the dualling amendments from Greens and Labor, and I think they all are extremely concerned. But that's cool. We're happy to let that ride. And in regards, Mr. Barr spoke earlier about changes that need to be made in this sector, and he signalled changes to hours of operation for poker machines, and I would just like to put on the record that the Canberra Liberals are certainly happy to embrace that, and obviously submissions that have to be made in regards regulatory impact, but we certainly don't have any qualms whatsoever with that. And so maybe after discussions like this, maybe we are potentially the three entities here getting to consensus on more things than we were some time ago. Let's hope that's the case.
Thank you, Mr Parton. The question is Mr Braddock's amendment to Mr Parton's amendment. Be agreed to. Chief Minister.
Thank you, Mr Assistant Speaker. Strip away all of the grandstanding, and there is actually some progress, so I welcome Mr Parton's support of that further harm reduction measure. I could spend the rest of the afternoon taking issue with certain elements of the commentary that we've just heard in this debate. I won't. I will make a few brief observations. The propensity to just load everything on the Treasurer and the taxpayer to avoid hard decisions is one that I have experienced a lot in this role, and I think anyone who is the Treasurer always will. But a value for money assessment is something that is undertaken, and regardless of whether the cost of a CMS is borne entirely by Canberra taxpayers, entirely by the club sector, or some combination of the two, $180 million is not an insubstantial amount of money. So it does demand a degree of scrutiny. And I think that is reasonable, and I would be stunned if any member in this place thought that $180 million would fly through, regardless of who was paying, on a single pass. And yes, what we have heard today does demonstrate that there is a high level of rigour and scrutiny in relation to public expenditure. And so there should be. In relation to this figure being in the public arena, I'm glad it now is. I wrote to the Gaming Minister some time ago authorising its release. So it is now in the public arena, and that is a good thing, because it might sharpen the focus on whether $180 million so easily got around simply by going across the border, why that is a legitimate issue to debate, and why I raised it in my opening remarks. When you are investing that much money, you would want it to work. And the suggestion that there would be no other guardrails around gaming machines as part of the policy that we have put forward is manifestly untrue. And I outlined in great detail the measures that we would intend to complement an ongoing reduction in the number of machines. And so essentially what we are all arguing about in the end is, will it be possible to have some form of lower cost CMS as we reduce the number of machines? And I've put this forward multiple times, So I reject any assertion that we have not engaged in this debate. The substantive issue is, how do we reduce the number of machines and reduce ongoing harm, and do it sooner rather than later? And what we have achieved out of this afternoon, and a number of robust conversations over the last several months, is some progress. Policy making can be difficult, Mr. Assistant Speaker. Sometimes you don't want to see how the sausage is made. What we are endeavouring to do, and the commitment that I have made and my colleagues have made, is to continue to talk and to try and make some progress. I am pleased that we have got somewhere. There is more to do, and hopefully out of this afternoon's debate, further progress may be possible in the future. So whilst we will not be supporting the amendments or the substantive motion, I accept that the numbers will be against us and it will pass. But we will remain committed to the implementation of the policy that we have announced. And again, I repeat the call that those who want to see fewer poker machines in this jurisdiction can support that pathway together with guardrails on the machines as they are reduced. And we should be able to do that in a way that supports the ongoing viability of our community club sector. That means a gradual transition. It means finding alternate revenue sources, and it means being honest about who's paying and how. And inevitably that job falls to the Treasurer, doesn't it? So again, I'll accept that responsibility and try and find a way through this. We've made some progress today, but the balance of this issue is clearly one that will feature in this election campaign and will sit in the future with the next Assembly.
Thank you, Chief Minister. Members, the question is that Mr Braddock's amendment to Mr Parton's amendment be agreed to. Mr Rattenbury.
Thank you, Mr Assistant Speaker, and I stand up to reflect on something that I do furiously agree with the Chief Minister on, is the necessity of value for money. We've now got a range of figures flying around, and like many of these debates, they get zipped around. What is fair to reflect is that, the figure we're now discussing, the 180, is actually, it's less than that. But it's in that kind of ballpark. But it's also a preliminary costing, and we've been in, I've been in a difficult position of trying to walk the line on these things, just as we hear other ministers who say, I can't put these things out yet. And, you've got to see the politics on these things as well. Oh, you can release the costing on your one, but not others. Let's be frank about that. But as we judge this, let's reflect on the fact that's a 20-year operating cost. A 20-year cost. Set up cost plus 20 years of operation. In that time, there will be $3.6 billion of net gaming machine revenue. $3.6 billion on current projections. So let's not kid ourselves what we're talking about here. And let's not kid ourselves about the fact that the alternative proposal also has a cost. At a minimum, on current prices of $15,000 a licence, $37.5 million just to buy the licences back. Now, what we know from the club sector is they think they should be paid more for them. So that number just goes up. And then if there are to be guardrails, and I'm pleased to hear that there will be, that's not cost-free. Whether it's a digital wallet or some other account-based system, which is kind of vaguely referenced. So, yes, we do need to have a value for money conversation. We need to understand that the number that's out there is a preliminary number. There's a lot dependent on the design features. But if we're going to talk about the cost, let's have an honest conversation where the alternative proposal also gets costed. Then we can start to have an apples and apples conversation.
Thank you, Mr Rattenbury. Members, the question is that Mr Braddock's amendment to Mr Parton's amendment be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. I think the noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells.